Uncle Casper has died, leaving behind a substantial estate and a chaotic, poorly drafted will that must now be legally deciphered. The document contains several high-stakes instructions. The first disputed clause reads, "I give £15,000 to Rebecca in the hope and belief she will share it with her two daughters, Daisy and Alice." The second clause involves a portfolio of shares. Casper declares he is holding exactly 50 of his 950 ICI shares on trust for his nephew Jonas. Finally, he instructs his trustees to distribute the residue of his estate among his most deserving relatives. Each of these clauses faces a different fate. The court must determine if they are valid express trusts, absolute gifts to the recipients, or void dispositions that must be returned to the estate. It is a mistake to assume that Casper's general intent to be generous is enough to bind this property. Generosity alone does not create a legal obligation. In equity, generous sentiments are legally meaningless without structural precision. A valid express trust must survive the strict doctrinal test of the 3 certainties. The first certainty is intention. The settlor must use language that imposes a mandatory, legally binding obligation on the trustee, rather than just a moral suggestion. The second is certainty of subject matter. Both the specific property being placed into the trust and the exact shares the beneficiaries are to receive must be identifiable. The third is certainty of objects. The beneficiaries must be defined with enough clarity that the court can identify exactly who has the right to enforce the trust. These are 3 distinct cumulative hurdles. The court evaluates each one independently, but a trust requires all 3 to remain standing. If even one pillar is missing, the legal structure collapses. Mastering these boundaries is the only way to determine who actually owns Casper's assets. We begin with Casper's first clause, the £15,000 left to Rebecca. Legal analysis here centers on the phrase, "in the hope." In trust law, words expressing a wish rather than a command are precatory words. The landmark case for precatory words is Re Adams and Kensington Vestry. A testator left property to his wife in full confidence that she would do what was right. The court ruled such language does not create a trust. Expressions of hope don't impose a legal duty. They're a moral wish the recipient can ignore. However, this is not a rigid rule of magic words. Under equity looks to intent rather than form, the court examines the entire context. For instance, in Paul v. Constance, a trust existed without a formal document. Repeated oral statements and joint use of an account manifested a clear intention. Casper's will, however, lacks that evidence of a binding command. His use of hope and belief mirrors Re Adams and fails to impose a mandatory duty. Warning tone. Pay close attention. Usually, when a trust fails, property returns to the estate. But when the failure is a lack of intention, a trust was never even attempted. Because no trust obligation was ever created, Rebecca takes the £15,000 as an outright gift. She owns the money completely with no legal obligation to share it. We move to Casper's second clause, the 50 ICI shares held for Jonas. Most trusts can be declared orally. You generally do not need formal paperwork for personal property. Land is the major exception, requiring signed writing. Since Casper is dealing with shares, his declaration is not barred by a lack of paperwork. The problem is identification. Casper has 950 shares, but hasn't specified which 50 belong to Jonas. The rule from Re London Wine Co. is you must segregate trust property. Physical items vary, so failing to separate them makes the subject matter uncertain. But Hunter v. Moss created an exception for intangible, identical assets like company shares. Applying Hunter v. Moss to Casper's shares, the subject matter is legally certain. Jonas's 50 shares are indistinguishable from the rest, so the trust is valid. But students often push this exception too far, leading to errors. While shares are intangible, physical money in a mixed bank account is treated differently. If a trustee fails to move trust money into a separate account, the trust fails. Since Casper's ICI shares are identical, indistinguishable units, the subject matter is certain, and the trust for Jonas is valid. Finally, we examine Casper's residue, the money intended for his most deserving relatives. Under the beneficiary principle, every trust needs a human beneficiary, Who has the standing to take the trustees to court if they mismanage funds? The legal test depends on if it's a fixed or discretionary trust. A fixed trust requires a complete list test to identify every beneficiary, but Casper gave his trustees a choice, creating a discretionary trust governed by the given postulant test. To pass this test, we don't need a full list of everyone. We only need to know if any given postulant is a member of the class. This test was established by the House of Lords in the case of McPhail v. Dalton. Historically, all trusts required a complete list, but by the mid-20th century, this rule was causing large discretionary trusts to fail. The House of Lords changed the law, allowing a discretionary trust to be valid as long as the class of beneficiaries is clearly defined. However, this requires conceptual certainty. The words used must have an objective linguistic meaning. Casper's use of the word relatives is conceptually certain. Under Baden's deed trusts, the court can objectively define what a relative is. But Casper added a second requirement. The relatives must be most deserving. Deserving is a subjective, internal judgment. There is no objective legal standard to determine who is more deserving. The term is conceptually uncertain, so the entire discretionary trust fails. Even if Casper avoided subjective words, there is one final hurdle. Imagine if he chose a certain class, like all residents of Greater London. Residence is conceptually certain, but millions of people creates a legal problem. If the class is so hopelessly wide that trustees cannot realistically make a selection, the trust is void. To be valid, a discretionary trust must be conceptually clear and administratively manageable. Casper's clause failed the very first step. We can now finalize the autopsy of Casper's will. Clause 1 failed the test for intention. Because the law sees this as a failed attempt to even start a trust, Rebecca keeps the £15,000 as an outright gift. Clause 2 is valid. The ICI shares are intangible and indistinguishable, so Casper's declaration created a valid trust for Jonas. Clause 3 failed for lack of object certainty. Because the property was meant for a trust that cannot be identified, we trigger the resulting trust mechanism. A resulting trust occurs when legal title to property is transferred, but the trust's purpose fails. Equity refuses to let the trustee keep the windfall. Instead, it forces the property to spring back to the original owner or their estate. The result? Rebecca keeps her cash, Jonas gets his shares, and the residue returns to the estate to be distributed according to intestacy laws. To create a binding trust, intention must be a command, property must be identified, and beneficiaries must be clear. Without all three, the testator's wishes are just words on a page.